Edward leaned back in his chair at the office, a sly grin on his face as he texted Cynthia. Just made the reservation. Private suite. We'll finally have the time we need. Cynthia sat at her desk, her heart racing as she read the message. She glanced around, paranoid that someone might see the exchange, but the office buzzed with the usual hum of phones ringing and keyboards clicking. No one paid attention to her. She quickly tapped back her response. Can't wait. Need this escape. This had all started innocently enough. Late-night conversations about work, shared frustrations over difficult clients, and drinks after hours. But it was the small touches, the stolen glances across the meeting table, that pushed their relationship into something far more dangerous. Edward wasn't like Adam. He was bold, unpredictable, and most of all, he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. But now, as the weekend getaway approached, Cynthia felt a growing unease settling in her stomach. Next morning, Cynthia stood in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air as she poured herself a cup. She could hear the soft clicking of Adam's fingers against the laptop keys, a sound she had grown used to over the years. For a moment, she watched him, his brow slightly furrowed, concentrating on the architectural design spread across his screen. His hair was messy from the shower, his t-shirt wrinkled, and he looked exhausted as always. But Adam had a calmness about him, an unwavering steadiness that had once comforted her. Busy day ahead? She asked, her voice sounding normal, like every other morning. But inside, the weight of her deceit felt like a boulder strapped to her chest, the kind of weight that couldn't be shifted no matter how hard she tried. Adam glanced up, the corners of his mouth lifting in a tired but genuine smile. Yeah, this client's project is turning into a nightmare. I'll probably be stuck in meetings all day. Just another day at the office. Cynthia forced her voice to stay even, to sound casual, but the guilt scratched at her insides. She took a long sip of coffee to keep herself from saying more. The lie was beginning to suffocate her, and she hated herself for it. In her overnight bag upstairs were clothes not for a normal workday, but for a romantic weekend with Edward, her boss and secret lover. Adam didn't notice. He never did. He trusted her too much, always assumed the best. Even when her absences started getting longer, her excuses more elaborate. Maybe we could do dinner tomorrow night? Adam asked, looking hopeful. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head. I could use some time with you away from all this work. I'll try to wrap things up early. Cynthia hesitated, the guilt gnawing harder. She could feel her stomach turning over, but she didn't let it show. Let's see how the day goes, she said, keeping her tone light. You know how crazy work can get. Adam chuckled softly, unaware of the storm brewing behind her eyes. Yeah, it's been a while since we had a proper date night. She bent down to kiss him on the cheek, the gesture feeling mechanical now. Adam reached up, gently brushing her hair back as she did, his touch soft and loving. Her throat tightened as she pulled away. She lingered by the door for a second longer, forcing a smile as she grabbed her purse. I'll see you tonight, she said, the lies slipping out too easily. Yeah, have a good day, Adam replied, already turning back to his laptop. As she walked out to the driveway, Cynthia took a deep breath, the cool morning air hitting her face. She climbed into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as her mind raced. She had perfected this double life, at least, that's what she told herself. But each time she left the house, the guilt grew heavier, and she wondered how much longer she could carry it. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Edward. Can't wait to see you. It's been too long. Cynthia's heart skipped a beat, a familiar rush of excitement and shame flooding through her. Edward had a way of making her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt with Adam in years. She hated herself for thinking it, for even feeling it, but the thrill was undeniable. The secrecy, the stolen moments, it was intoxicating. But so was the guilt. Every time she saw Adam's trusting face, her heart twisted with regret. Yet, she couldn't stop. She tapped out a quick response. Me too. I'll be there soon. The drive to the resort felt longer than usual, her fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. Edward was already there, waiting in their room. The luxury hotel was nestled in the middle of nowhere, hidden from the world, perfect for an affair. As Cynthia parked the car and grabbed her bag, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. She saw the guilt written across her face. She tried to shake it off as she walked into the hotel, taking a deep breath to steady herself. When she opened the door to their suite, Edward was there, lounging on the bed with a glass of wine in his hand. He flashed her a smile. "Finally," he said, sitting up and patting the spot beside him on the bed. "I've been waiting for you." Cynthia hesitated for a split second, then forced herself to smile as she walked over and sat down. "Sorry, I just trafficked," she lied, trying to ignore the tightening in her chest. Edward placed his hand on her back, tracing slow circles along her spine. "You're tense," he murmured, leaning in to kiss her neck. "We're supposed to be enjoying this, remember?" "I know," Cynthia said, her voice shaky. She let him kiss her, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on Adam, on the lies she had been telling him, on how much of a mess she had made of everything. Edward leaned back, sensing her unease. "What's going on? You're not usually like this." Cynthia stood up abruptly, walking toward the window that overlooked the private beach. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the horizon. She watched the waves crash against the shore, trying to gather her thoughts. She knew Edward wasn't someone who cared about her hesitation. He thrived on excitement, on danger, on the thrill of doing something forbidden. That was part of what had drawn her to him in the first place. "It's nothing," she finally said, turning back toward him. "Just work stuff." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Work stuff? You're lying, Cynthia." "What is it really?" She looked away, biting her lip. "Adam doesn't suspect anything, does he?" Edward asked, the question laced with an unsettling calm. Cynthia shook her head. "No, he's too busy with his projects. He trusts me." Edward chuckled, a dark laugh that sent a shiver down her spine. "That's why this works so well. He doesn't even see it coming." He stood up and walked toward her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "But we don't have to think about him right now, do we?" Cynthia stiffened in his embrace. She knew she should let go, should end things before it got worse. But instead, she kissed him back, trying to lose herself in the moment, trying to forget the reality of what she was doing. The weekend passed in a haze of passion and quiet moments stolen by the beach. They spent their days walking along the shoreline, the salt air making Cynthia's hair wild and tangled. Edward would reach for her hand, and for a while, she would let herself believe this was all that mattered. But at night, as they lay in the large, soft bed, Cynthia's thoughts would drift back to Adam. She remembered the way he always stayed up late working, how he would surprise her with little gestures of love, a cup of tea while she read, a spontaneous movie night after a long day. Adam was safe, reliable. She used to love that about him. But now, everything felt wrong. The thrill of the affair that had once been intoxicating was turning into something else. "I can't stop thinking about it," Cynthia admitted late one night, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore just outside their window. Edward turned his head to look at her, frowning slightly. "About what?" "Adam. The lies. All of this. It's getting too much." Her voice was a whisper, barely loud enough to be heard over the wind. Edward's frown deepened. "We've talked about this, Cynthia. You need to stop worrying. It's not like Adam's going to find out. But what if he does?" Cynthia's voice trembled. "What if he knows? And he's just waiting?" Edward sat up, staring at her. "Adam doesn't suspect a thing. He's too wrapped up in his own life to even notice what's going on around him." Cynthia felt a pang of guilt twist in her stomach. Adam was wrapped up in his work, but that didn't mean he was blind. She had underestimated him before. What if she was doing it again? Edward reached out, gently tilting her chin up so she had a look at him. "Listen," he said softly, but there was an edge to his tone. "You knew what you were getting into when this started. You wanted an escape, didn't you? That's why you're here. So stop overthinking it." Cynthia swallowed hard. She didn't know how to respond. Everything about this felt wrong now. She had thought this affair would give her the excitement she had been craving, but it was only leading her deeper into a mess she couldn't clean up. The next morning, they packed up their bags in silence. Edward was in a good mood, humming softly as he threw his clothes into his suitcase. Cynthia, on the other hand, felt numb. She moved through the motions, trying not to think too much about what she was doing, about what she had done. As they walked out of the resort, Edward pulled her close, kissing her one last time before they parted ways. "I'll see you tomorrow at the office," he said with a smirk. Cynthia nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, tomorrow?" But as she drove home, the weight of everything began to press down on her again. The weekend had given her a temporary escape, but now that she was returning to her life with Adam, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. Edward had reassured her that everything would be fine, but she couldn't trust him, not entirely. He didn't understand the depth of what she was feeling, the guilt that gnawed at her constantly. She had been reckless, and now she was afraid she was going to pay the price. When she walked through the door of her house later that evening, Adam was sitting on the couch, his laptop open on his knees. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, but there was a hint of something in his eyes, something she hadn't noticed before. "Hey," he said, closing his laptop. "How was your weekend?" Cynthia froze, her heart pounding. "Good," she said quickly, forcing another smile. "It was fine." Adam nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good to hear. We'll talk later, okay?" Cynthia blinked, confused. "Talk about what?" Adam's smile didn't reach his eyes this time. "About us?" Cynthia stepped into the office on Monday morning, her stomach twisting with unease. She had barely slept the night before, haunted by thoughts of what she had done, of the lies she had woven so tightly around herself. The affair with Edward had started as an escape, a thrilling secret that had now turned into a suffocating trap. Every day, she felt the walls closing in, the pressure building, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something shattered. As the elevator doors slid open, Cynthia forced herself to take a deep breath. She stepped into the familiar hum of office life, keyboards clacking, phones ringing, co-workers exchanging idle morning chatter. For a fleeting moment, everything felt normal. Maybe she could get through the day without anyone noticing her internal turmoil. But then she saw it. Her steps faltered, the coffee in her hand slipping through her fingers and crashing to the floor. She didn't even flinch as the hot liquid splattered across her shoes. Her eyes were locked on the enormous banner hanging from the ceiling directly above her desk. "Cheaters get caught." The bold letters screamed at her, but that wasn't the worst of it. Beneath the damning words was an enormous photo, a still image of her mid-act with Edward. Her face, her body, all of it on display in humiliating detail. It was unmistakable. For a moment, Cynthia couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, her heart pounding so violently in her chest she thought she might collapse. The office had gone eerily silent. Every eye was on her, wide, disbelieving, some filled with disgust, others with shock. Her co-workers stood frozen, staring at the banner, at the photo, then at her. "Is that Cynthia?" someone whispered, but it felt as though the words were coming from a distant place, drowned out by the roar of panic flooding her mind. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the edge of a desk to steady herself. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She couldn't think, couldn't process the enormity of what was happening. How could this be real? How could her life unravel so quickly, so completely, in front of everyone? Tears stung the corners of her eyes as she struggled to regain control of her breathing. Her vision blurred as she turned and bolted from the office. She shoved past people in the hallway, ignoring the shocked faces of her colleagues, the whispers that followed her down the corridor. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. Bursting into the street, Cynthia felt the cold air slap her face, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside her. She fumbled in her purse for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Adam's number. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. "No, no, no." Cynthia's voice cracked as she tried again, but the same result, straight to voicemail. "Adam, please pick up," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling as she left a desperate message. "I can explain, please, just call me back. Please." She sank onto a nearby bench, her head in her hands, her mind racing. Who did this? How could Adam know? She had been so careful. No one else could have known about her and Edward. Her stomach turned to the thought of Adam seeing that photo, of him knowing everything. Her entire life, her marriage, her reputation, was unraveling in a single moment. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her hand. For a brief second, hope surged through her, thinking it might be Adam calling her back. But when she looked at the screen, it was a text from an unknown number. Hesitantly, she opened the message. "You should have been more careful. Everyone knows now." Cynthia's hands went cold, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. Who could this be? Was it Adam? Was it Edward? She felt her head spinning, the world closing in on her as panic took hold again. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a notification from her bank. Cynthia's heart skipped a beat as she opened the message, her eyes scanning the screen. A large withdrawal had been made from their joint account, one she hadn't authorized. She scrolled through the transactions, her pulse quickening with each line. Adam had emptied the account. Every last dollar was gone. "Oh my God," she whispered, standing up abruptly, her mind racing. What was happening? Was this his revenge? Had Adam set all of this up? She dialed him again, her fingers trembling as she held the phone to her ear. Voicemail again. "Adam, please. I don't know what's going on, but we need to talk." Her voice was breaking now, her words coming out in frantic sobs. "Please just call me back. I can explain everything. I'm so sorry." The minutes dragged on as she stood there, alone on the sidewalk, her thoughts spiraling out of control. People passed by her, oblivious to her world crumbling around her, as she desperately tried to figure out her next move. She couldn't go back to the office. She couldn't face anyone there. The shame was too overwhelming. With shaking hands, she scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hesitating over Edward's name. She didn't want to involve him, didn't want to drag him into this, but she didn't know where else to turn. She pressed the call button, listening to the phone ring. He answered on the third ring. "Cynthia?" Edward's voice was calm, but she could hear the confusion in his tone. "Edward," she gasped, her voice barely holding together. "Something's happened. It's everywhere. There's a photo, a banner. Everyone knows." There was silence on the other end for a long moment. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Someone put up a banner at the office," she choked out. "A banner with a photo of us. Everyone saw it. Adam knows. He's gone. He's taken everything." "What?" Edward's voice hardened. "How could he have, Cynthia? Where are you?" "I don't know what to do," she sobbed, her free hand covering her mouth as the panic swelled. "I don't know where to go." "I'll figure something out," Edward said, his voice steady, though there was tension beneath it. "Don't do anything stupid. Just go somewhere safe. I'll call you back." He hung up, leaving Cynthia standing there, alone with her phone still pressed to her ear. She stared at the screen, the dread tightening around her chest like a vice. She couldn't think straight. The weight of the humiliation, the fear of what Adam would do next, threatened to crush her completely. She didn't know where to go. Adam was gone. Her job was ruined. And the only person she had left was Edward, the man who had dragged her into this mess in the first place. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again, jolting her back to reality. It was another notification, this time from her security system. The locks on her house had been changed. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the message again, and the reality of what was happening sank in. Adam wasn't just angry. He was erasing her. Cynthia's car tore down the road as she sped home, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The air in the car felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if it were closing in around her. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She needed to see Adam, to explain herself. Maybe she could fix this. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage everything if she could just talk to him. But the moment she turned into her street, her heart lurched. Something was wrong. She slowed down as she neared the house, and her blood ran cold. Scattered across the front lawn were her clothes, shoes, bags, all thrown about carelessly. The neatly manicured yard was now littered with pieces of her life. Dresses, jackets, books, and shoes lay in piles as if they had been dumped from the front door. She pulled into the driveway, her hands trembling as she put the car in park. Panic seized her chest as she stepped out, her eyes scanning the mess. The items were hers, but the most valuable things, her jewelry, the designer clothes, were conspicuously absent. They were gone. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Cynthia rushed to the front door, fumbling for her key. The small metal object felt useless in her shaking hands. She shoved it into the lock, but nothing. The key wouldn't turn. Her throat tightened as the reality of it sank in. The locks, she whispered to herself, trying again in vain. No, no, no. She banged on the door, louder this time, the panic rising in her chest. Adam, Adam, open the door, she screamed, her voice cracking. There was no answer. The house was silent. Too silent. The house that had once been her sanctuary, filled with warmth and love, now felt like an abandoned shell. Desperation clawed at her as she pounded on the door again, harder this time. Adam, please. Let me in. We need to talk. She slammed her fist against the wood, but there was nothing. Not a sound. Cynthia's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the front steps. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around at the debris of her life scattered on the lawn. The weight of what had happened hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over her until she couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was her entire life falling apart in front of her, piece by piece. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and for a fleeting moment, hope sparked inside her. Maybe it was Adam. Maybe he was willing to talk. She grabbed the phone and looked at the screen. It wasn't Adam. It was her mother, Cynthia. Her mother's voice came through the line, concerned but distant, as if she knew something was wrong but didn't know how deep the trouble went. Mom, Cynthia's voice broke as she tried to form the words. She took a deep breath, trying to hold herself together. I need to come over. It's bad. Really bad. There was a long pause on the other end. What happened, Cynthia? You sound... I can't talk about it right now. I need to come over. Cynthia cut her off, her voice trembling. I don't have anywhere else to go. Of course, come here. I'll be waiting for you, her mother said softly, but Cynthia could hear the worry in her tone. She hung up and stood shakily, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. She glanced one more time at the lawn, at her scattered belongings, then turned back to her car. As she opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, a deep sense of dread settled over her. She had nowhere left to turn. As Cynthia pulled out of the driveway, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. She hesitated before looking at it, her heart pounding as she read the words on the screen. You thought you could keep this secret? You're paying for it now. This is just the beginning. Her hands went cold, and she almost dropped the phone. She didn't recognize the number. The message sent a wave of terror coursing through her. Was it Adam? Was it Edward? Who was doing this to her? Cynthia drove in a daze, barely aware of the streets passing by as she made her way to her mother's house. Every worst-case scenario flashed through her mind. Adam had always been calm, reasonable, but this was beyond anything she had expected. He wasn't just angry, he had erased her. Everything she thought she had was gone. When she finally pulled into her mother's driveway, Cynthia sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the familiar house. She used to come here as a child, running to her mother for comfort whenever things got tough. But now there was no comfort to be found. She dragged herself out of the car and up the steps, her feet feeling heavy as lead. Her mother opened the door before Cynthia could knock, her face etched with concern. Cynthia, her mother's voice trailed off as she looked at her daughter, clearly seeing the state she was in. Without a word, Cynthia collapsed into her mother's arms, the sobs racking her body. Her mother held her tightly, whispering soothing words, but it did little to calm the storm inside Cynthia's mind. After a long while, her mother guided her inside, sitting her down on the couch. Tell me what happened, she said gently, sitting beside her. Cynthia wiped her tear-streaked face, trying to form the words, but it felt impossible to explain. Where would she even begin? The affair? The humiliation at the office? Adam's disappearance? I made a huge mistake, Mom, Cynthia whispered, her voice barely audible. I did something horrible, and now Adam's gone. He threw me out. He changed the locks, and all my things are on the lawn. He took everything. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. I don't know what to do. Her mother's eyes widened, and she sat in stunned silence for a moment. Cynthia, what did you do? I was having an affair, Cynthia admitted, the words choking her. With my boss. Adam found out, and now everything's ruined. He's punishing me. He emptied our bank account, and now someone's sending me messages, threatening me. Her mother's face turned pale as she absorbed the confession. She sat back, shaking her head in disbelief. Cynthia, how could you? Her voice caught, but she quickly swallowed the words, as if unsure what to say. I know, Cynthia sobbed. I messed everything up, but now, I don't even know where Adam is. I don't know what he's going to do next. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she took Cynthia's hand. You'll stay here tonight. We'll figure this out. Okay. Cynthia nodded, though the pit in her stomach told her that there was no fixing this. Not anymore. The house of cards she had built on lies and betrayal had finally come crashing down, and now, all she could do was wait for the fallout. Then her mother, a stern woman with lines of worry etched deep into her face, stood with crossed arms, holding a small brown package. Her mother's eyes were hard, filled with a suspicion that made Cynthia's stomach churn. This came for you this morning, her mother said, her voice tight as she held out the package. It's from Adam. The weight of the box seemed to increase as Cynthia took it into her trembling hands. Her heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. Something about the way the package looked, plain, unmarked, made dread coil tightly in her chest. Her mother stepped aside, letting her in without another word. The atmosphere in the house was thick with unease. It was clear that her mother knew something was wrong, but Cynthia wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. She moved to the dining table, where she hesitated, staring at the package as if it might explode. Her mother stood in the doorway, watching with folded arms. Aren't you going to open it? Her mother asked quietly, her voice strained. Cynthia swallowed hard. Yeah, I will. She slowly unwrapped the package, her fingers fumbling clumsily with the tape. As the box opened, her breath hitched. Inside was a stack of their wedding photos, but they were unrecognizable. Torn, burnt around the edges, some ripped straight down the middle, separating her image from Adam's. Each picture seemed to hold more malice than the last, pictures of their happiest moments, now defiled. She ran her fingers over the edges of one photo, the one of their first dance as husband and wife. She remembered the day vividly. Adam had twirled her across the floor, his eyes glowing with love. The memory felt so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. Her mother gasped softly from across the room. What on earth? Cynthia's fingers shook as she pulled out the final item at the bottom of the box, a single letter, folded neatly. It was addressed to her in Adam's unmistakable handwriting. She unfolded the letter, her pulse hammering in her ears. You didn't think I'd find out? You took everything from me. Now I'm taking everything from you. Cynthia read the words over and over, each sentence a knife twisting deeper into her chest. She felt the walls closing in on her, her breath quickening. Adam's anger had gone far beyond what she'd imagined. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. He wanted to destroy her. Before she could fully absorb the message, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Startled, she fumbled with it, glancing at the screen. It was an unknown number. Normally, she wouldn't answer, but something compelled her to pick up. Hello, she managed, her voice shaky. Ma'am, this is Officer Daniels from the local police department, a calm but firm voice said on the other end. We need you to come down to the station. There's been a report filed against you by your husband, Adam Adams, for embezzlement and fraud. The words hit her like a physical blow. Cynthia stammered. That's a mistake. There has to be a mistake. I'm afraid not, ma'am. Your husband has provided evidence that you've been siphoning funds from a joint account into a separate one. We have several transactions flagged for investigation, and we'll need you to answer some questions. Cynthia's legs wobbled beneath her, and she collapsed into the nearest chair. Her mother rushed forward, her face a mask of confusion and alarm. What is it? What's going on? Her mother asked urgently, leaning in. It's Adam, Cynthia croaked, clutching the phone tightly to her ear. He's saying I stole from him. Embezzlement. Fraud. The officer's voice continued, steady and indifferent, as if this was just another routine case. We'll need you to come down as soon as possible, ma'am. If you refuse to cooperate, a warrant will be issued for your arrest. Wait! Cynthia's voice cracked. This is a lie. I didn't take any money from him. He's setting me up? The officer paused. Ma'am, you'll have the opportunity to present your side. But for now, we strongly suggest you come down to the station voluntarily. Cynthia's hands shook uncontrollably as she ended the call. Her mind spun, trying to piece together the gravity of what had just been dropped on her. This couldn't be real. Adam was angry, yes, but this? Framing her for fraud? It didn't make sense. She wasn't a criminal. She was just a woman who had made a terrible, selfish mistake. But now it seemed Adam was intent on punishing her in ways she could never have anticipated. Her mother, who had been hovering over her, grabbed the phone from Cynthia's hand and snapped. What the hell is going on, Cynthia? I don't know, Cynthia whispered, her voice hollow. I don't know anymore. Her mother stared at her, bewildered. Embezzlement? Fraud? What have you gotten yourself into? Cynthia pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the noise, the confusion, the mess her life had become. I didn't steal anything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam's doing this to get back at me. He's trying to ruin me. Her mother sank into the chair opposite her, her face pale with disbelief. Adam would never do something like that. Are you sure? I'm sure, Cynthia spat, the anger building inside her. He found out about the affair, and now he's tearing my life apart piece by piece. Her mother shook her head slowly, as if still trying to grasp the situation. Oh, Cynthia, what have you done? I didn't steal, Cynthia repeated, her voice firmer this time. But Adam, he's setting me up? I don't know how, but he's manipulating everything. I didn't even know he could do this. Her mother sighed, rubbing her temples. You need to get a lawyer. Right away. This is serious, Cynthia. You could go to jail. Cynthia felt her stomach churn at the thought. Jail. Her mind flashed back to the letter, to the torn and burned photos. Adam wasn't just angry. He was hell-bent on revenge, and he was willing to go to any lengths to make sure she suffered for what she had done. I know, Cynthia said quietly, the weight of it all crashing down on her. I need help. Her mother nodded, though her face still bore the disappointment and confusion that Cynthia had feared most. We'll figure this out, but you have to face the consequences of what you've done. Cynthia could only nod. The consequences were already here, and they were worse than she ever could have imagined. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the police station made everything feel surreal. Cynthia sat stiffly in the interrogation room, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to control the tremor in her fingers. Across the table, a detective flipped through a file, pausing every so often to glance at her with a mixture of pity and indifference. It was the kind of look reserved for people who had made choices so damaging that their lives seemed to implode from the inside out. You understand the charges, right? The detective asked, finally looking up from the file. His tone was professional, detached. Cynthia nodded weakly, her voice lost in the chaos that had consumed her mind. She had gone over it with her lawyer: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. Words she had never imagined would apply to her. This can't be happening, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her thoughts spun, flashing back to all the tiny choices that led her here. Each lie, each betrayal, piling up until it collapsed on her. The detective slid a few pages across the table, summaries of Adam's evidence. Cynthia flinched as her eyes landed on the photographs of her secret meetings with Edward, the bank transactions that looked like she had been siphoning money from Adam's accounts, the text messages, every misstep meticulously documented. Adam hadn't just found out about the affair. He had been planning this for months. She shook her head slowly, trying to make sense of it. He framed me, she said, the words feeling like ash on her tongue. The detective raised an eyebrow. Framed? It looks pretty clear-cut from where I'm sitting. Your husband has filed for divorce, and there's a case for fraud here. You transferred significant sums from your joint accounts into a private one. Can you explain that? I didn't do it. He's lying. Cynthia shot up from her seat, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I never took any money. I didn't even know. He set me up. The detective looked unimpressed. Ma'am, if you have evidence to support that, your lawyer can present it. But right now, you're facing some serious charges. I'd suggest you sit down and calm yourself before making this worse. Her knees felt weak as she sank back into the chair. This was all part of Adam's plan. He had known from the start, and instead of confronting her, he had bided his time, methodically pulling her life apart, thread by thread. After what felt like hours, Cynthia was released, pending further investigation. The relief of not being behind bars was fleeting. She knew this was only the beginning. Back in her mother's living room, Cynthia collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The ticking of the clock was the only sound, each second an unbearable reminder of the mess she was in. Her mother sat across from her, silent, unable to offer comfort this time. Cynthia felt her mother's disappointment like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. "What are you going to do now?" her mother finally asked, breaking the tense silence. "I don't know," Cynthia said, her voice hollow. "I don't even know where to start." Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She ignored it, knowing full well it was Edward. He had been trying to call her nonstop since the scandal broke. She couldn't face him, not now. What could he possibly say to make this better? They were both drowning in the fallout, but Cynthia had to deal with the wreckage of her entire life. Edward's messages had been desperate at first. Apologies, pleas for her to answer, and then finally silence. His career was in ruins, and his wife had filed for divorce almost immediately after the news broke. The company had launched an internal investigation into their affair, and he was all but finished in the business world. Yet none of that brought Cynthia any solace. He was a casualty, just like her. The real victor, the only one left unscathed, was Adam. A week later, Cynthia sat in a nearly empty cafe, her lawyer seated across from her. His face was impassive as he explained the next steps. "Adam has made himself unreachable," he said, sliding another stack of papers across the table. "We've confirmed he withdrew all your joint savings the day after he filed for divorce. He's transferred the money into accounts we can't trace, and the house has already been sold. We can contest this, but without access to the funds, it's going to be a long legal battle." Cynthia's stomach twisted at the thought. How is this even legal? He can't just vanish and take everything. Her lawyer sighed, his expression softening slightly. "He's done his homework, Cynthia. He's been planning this for a while, and it looks like he's covered his tracks well. We'll fight it, but I have to be honest, it's going to be an uphill battle." Cynthia could barely process the words. Her life had crumbled so completely, so quickly, that she didn't even know where to begin picking up the pieces. "And the embezzlement charges?" she asked quietly. "The police are still investigating. There's a good chance we can prove that Adam manipulated the accounts to make it look like you were involved, but it's not going to be easy. He's covered his tracks there, too." Cynthia leaned back in her chair, feeling the walls close in again. She had nothing left, no home, no money, no reputation. Adam had made sure of that. The man she once trusted, the man she had betrayed, had systematically dismantled every part of her life. Her lawyer stood to leave, gathering his papers into his briefcase. "I'll be in touch as soon as I hear anything new. In the meantime, try to keep your head down. We'll get through this." Cynthia barely managed a nod. As the door closed behind him, she stared out the window, watching people pass by, their lives untouched by the storm that had obliterated hers. Days turned into weeks. Cynthia moved through the world like a ghost, avoiding friends, ignoring calls from anyone who hadn't already distanced themselves from the scandal. Her mother had tried to support her, but even she was beginning to lose patience. "You need to start thinking about your future," her mother urged one afternoon. "You can't just sit here and let your life fall apart." "What future?" Cynthia shot back bitterly. "Everything I had is gone. Adam took it all, and I helped him by being so stupid." Her mother sighed, placing a hand on Cynthia's shoulder. "You made mistakes, yes, but you have to fight. You can't just give up now." Cynthia knew her mother was right, but the fight felt insurmountable. How could she claw her way out of this when Adam had erased every trace of her former life? She hadn't just lost her husband and her home, she had lost herself. And the thought of facing the long, uncertain road ahead felt like another unbearable weight. As the days passed, Cynthia realized that no matter how hard it was, she had no choice but to face the consequences head-on. Adam might have taken everything from her, but if she had learned one thing, It was that she couldn't let him take what little remained of her dignity. The days blurred into weeks, then months, each one heavier than the last. Cynthia's life unraveled slowly, painfully. She was no longer Cynthia, the confident woman who once balanced a career, a marriage, and a hidden affair with reckless abandon. Now, she was a shell of herself, consumed by the consequences of her decisions. It started with her job. The scandal with Edward had spread like wildfire, tearing through the office gossip mill and leaving her reputation in tatters. HR had called her into a meeting one cold afternoon. The tension in the room was palpable, and Cynthia could already sense what was coming. "We've conducted an internal investigation," the HR manager said, her voice flat, eyes avoiding Cynthia's. "Given the circumstances, we've decided that it's in the company's best interest to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Cynthia stared blankly at the woman across from her. Effective immediately? The words were hollow in her mouth. The HR manager nodded, sliding a folder across the desk. "You'll receive your severance package, but we expect you to leave the premises today. Security will help you gather your things." It was over. Everything she had worked for, all those long hours, all the sacrifices she had made for what? To be unceremoniously discarded like a liability. As she packed her things, the whispers behind her stung like 1,000 needles. The office that had once been her second home now felt like a hostile battlefield. She avoided eye contact, her face burning with shame as she walked past her former colleagues, their judgment weighing heavily on her back. The loss of her job was just the beginning. Cynthia had hoped, even after everything, that Adam would still talk to her, that they could find a way to mend things. But every call she made went unanswered, every email ignored. His silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. She went to the house one last time, hoping to find him there, to beg for another chance. But when she arrived, there was nothing left of the life they had built together. The house was empty, sold to someone else. Adam had vanished, leaving no trace, as if their years together had meant nothing. All that was left were the memories, and even those felt tainted now. Desperation clawed at her as she tried to reach out to him in every way she could think of. But Adam had blocked her on every platform, changed his number, disappeared from the places they used to frequent. He had severed all ties, wiping her from his life with surgical precision. One night, after weeks of silence, she sat in her mother's living room, her phone clutched in her hand. She stared at the screen, scrolling through old photos of her and Adam. Happy moments, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries. Moments she had taken for granted. Her fingers hovered over the call button. She dialed his number, half hoping this time he might pick up. But once again, the call went straight to voicemail. Her voice cracked as she left the message. "Adam, please. I'm sorry. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but please, I need to talk to you. I need to explain. I need to fix this." Her words trailed off, her chest tightening with the crushing realization that she was speaking into the void. Adam wasn't listening. He never would again. The days following the message were unbearable. With no job, no home, and no one to turn to, Cynthia retreated into herself. She spent hours in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her affair, every lie she had told, every chance she had to stop, and how she ignored them all. Her phone, once buzzing with texts and calls, was now silent, except for the occasional spam message. Her mother, though supportive in the beginning, had grown weary of Cynthia's isolation. One evening, after weeks of watching her daughter spiral, she sat down at the foot of Cynthia's bed, the disappointment in her eyes unmistakable. "You can't live like this," her mother said softly but firmly. "I know you're hurting, but this isn't going to fix anything. You need to start picking up the pieces." Cynthia didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of her guilt and shame pressed down on her so hard she could barely breathe. How could she pick up the pieces when everything she touched seemed to fall apart? "You made mistakes," her mother continued, "but you can't let them define you. You have to move forward, even if it's hard. Move forward." Cynthia wondered what that even looked like. The future felt like a dark, empty space, with no path, no direction. She had gambled with her life, and she had lost everything. Meanwhile, Adam had moved on. He had left the city, far away from the mess Cynthia had created. He wasn't the kind of man to make a spectacle of his pain. Instead, he had plotted his escape methodically, leaving no trace of himself behind. In a new city, under a new name, Adam rebuilt his life. He didn't have much to begin with, just the money he had taken, the clothes on his back, and the satisfaction of knowing that the people who had betrayed him were now drowning in the consequences of their actions. He had rented a small apartment, started a new job, and slowly began to piece his life back together. It wasn't easy, but it was peaceful. No more lies, no more deception. He had control now, and that was enough. Every so often, when he allowed his thoughts to wander, he would think of Cynthia. Not with longing, but with a cold, detached sense of closure. She had been a part of his life once, but that chapter was over. She was suffering the consequences of her choices, and while he hadn't forgiven her, he had found his own version of peace. Adam didn't look back. He refused to. What was the point? That life was over, buried beneath the weight of Cynthia's betrayal. For Cynthia, the road ahead was lonely. She had once thought she could juggle everything, her marriage, her affair, her career, without any real consequences. She had believed that she could keep it all, that she could have the best of both worlds. But now, all she had left were regrets and the overwhelming sense of loss. The silence from Adam was the loudest reminder of what she had destroyed. She had thought he would confront her, scream, fight, anything but this void. His absence was his final act of revenge, and it was the most painful one of all. Cynthia knew she had no choice but to keep moving forward, even if the road ahead was bleak. Every step felt heavy, and the shadows of her choices followed her everywhere she went. The loneliness, the guilt, and the shame, they were her constant companions now. And though she had no idea where the path would lead, she knew one thing for certain. She had lost everything she once held dear, and there was no going back. Adam had won, and in the end, she was left to walk the lonely road alone.